I think one of the things that was similar to everyone, and it's different from now, because now war, when we look at it, is very sterilized in the sense of what the community sees. Back in Vietnam, and I was part of that generation during that time, the war was on television every single night. Every single night you saw the battles. There were actually being fought. You saw the soldiers laying on the ground killed or wounded. You saw the planes landing every single day with rows and rows of coffins of American soldiers being unloaded. That was outlawed for a while in this country, and the journalists couldn't see that during the early Iraq and Afghanistan war because it had such a tremendous impact. But you also saw the Vietnamese children running and crying in the streets after they were being burned by napalm. And so you saw how many of those individuals, both on the US side and the American side, were being impacted, and you saw it every night. My brother was in Vietnam as a Marine. And I remember that one time we knew, and we always knew where our family members were, and we knew that he was a Marine in Da Nang. And so on television one night it showed during the Tet Offensive, when it was very destructive, that over 600 Marines had been killed taking a hill in Da Nang. My mother saw that, we all saw that. For 3 days straight she cried until the Red Cross, because then they knew that the families were seeing this on TV, so as soon as they could, the soldiers themselves, the individuals would notify the Red Cross to notify the families. So when the Red Cross finally notified my mom 3 days later that my brother was okay, then she could rest in peace. Of course, I had cousins that were medics that did make it out of Vietnam that were killed. But I think that was probably the biggest thing, is that you saw what was happening every single day. And so it wasn't just numbers, it was actual bodies and actual young people that you saw laying there. And so I think when the coffins were coming, you weren't saying, oh, is he Latino, or is he black, or is he white? You were just saying, another young American killed in Vietnam. And so I think that was something that was similar to everyone. An estimate is that over 27 million Americans had a relative or a family member that was injured or killed in Vietnam. So we talk about the impact to our society, that was tremendous. My brother left for Vietnam on Mother's Day, and he says that's the first time that he questioned what had he done, because he volunteered, because he left my mother on that day, left her crying because he was going to Vietnam. But again, that happened to so many others that were during that time that really impacted the families. I was an anti-war protester. My family was really a microcosm of the Latino community. I was an anti-war protester. My brother-in-law was a conscious objector. I had my brother was a Marine and 14 cousins, all in Vietnam, all at the same time in every branch of the service, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And so when we talk about, did I know about Vietnam before the film? Absolutely, because we lived during that era. And why I think this type of film is so critical, because that story has to be told, the sacrifices that our young people made during that time and that the families made in support of those young people need to be told. And so I think and you know, one of the things I want to mention is that my brother always felt that the anti-war protests had prolonged the war. Years later we talked about it. I felt that we had shortened the war. Do we agree to this day? No, but we love each other and we respect each other's opinions. And I think that was also part of the Latino community at that time. That we're just as splintered and just as divided as general society, with people protesting the war because they thought they needed to do that, with people fighting in the war because they were patriotic and felt they needed to do that, but we respected each other because we knew that in the end, that family bond was greater than anything else. And so the way my family was a microcosm of the Latino community was a microcosm of American society. Like I said, you had the protesters, you had those that were serving in battle, you had those that were conscious objectors, and so you had all those kinds of things that were in common during that time. Now, were there some differences? Yes. I think one of the main differences was the fact that when they were there in Vietnam, we did realize that there was an issue of race and racism, that they were fighting for democracy for another country, when oftentimes Latinos didn't have democracy here in this country. But one of the soldiers, in fact, one of the themes that ran across the whole issue was that Latinos felt that, okay, we understand, we're not blind to the racism at home, but we understand that our role, that our community demands that our role be good men being good soldiers. And they said that they never lost sight of the fact that they had to be good soldiers in that battle, even if they didn't agree with the battle itself. And there was a comment that I won't take the time to read because I know time is short, with Rosalio Munoz, that some of you may have heard, where he talks about on the 16th of September, he says that he declares his independence from the selective service because he was one of the most outspoken conscientious objectors. And that was the difference that I think occurred during that time, is that our Latinos, and you mentioned this as well, they really either weren't aware of the deferments or they didn't qualify for them if they did become aware of them, because they didn't know the system. That was probably the biggest difference. And it was more of a difference between being poor and uneducated rather than ethnicity, because African Americans also faced that issue. Where if you weren't in college, and how many of us were in college at that time, you went to war. That was your alternative. You got drafted. If you didn't get a medical deferment, and how many people knew about that or could afford doctors that would write up those kinds of things? If you didn't get a medical deferment, you went to war. Again, the poor and the uneducated and Latinos and other minorities. And so he talks about that in his declaration. He says, our young men are being used as cannon fodder to go to the front lines. And then the other thing was conscious objector. A lot of people didn't, that took such a huge, long process. And then, of course, the fourth thing was the issue of, do you leave the country? Many Americans left to Canada. Every Mexicano I interviewed, and I interviewed many, said they never thought about leaving the country. They said, how could we leave our families? Even to go to Mexico, they go, you know, I'm not from Mexico. They said, we're from here. This is our country. How could we leave our families? So the family bond was so strong. And then they said, the last thing we would ever want is to our families think that we were cowards. So even that option was closed off to a lot of Latinos because of their belief in that whole situation. And so I think that one of the other issues that was important was, as I mentioned briefly before, was the issue of race and politics. Yes, they knew there was discrimination, but they, to the person, never lost their idea of being patriotic. And it's an interesting contradiction where they're fighting for a country that doesn't often give us the kinds of freedom that it has. And if I have a moment, I want to read, because I think that in the conclusion of my book, I read about what one Latino said, and I think he really sums up the feelings of a lot of the people that I spoke to. And I'm blind with glasses or without glasses, so you'll have to excuse me. But he said, the patriotism of the majority of Chicano veterans remains unshaken, even though they are not blind to the problems of race and class in U.S. domestic and foreign policy. And even though the great majority of them came to disagree with U.S. policy in Vietnam, their disillusionment underscores a sense of tragedy that many convey in their stories. Comrades were lost, and acts of violence were committed which can never be undone. It darkens their memories of having been good soldiers and brave men. In the end, they are left questioning the value of what they did in Vietnam and what it all means. And as one veteran stated, did the war accomplish anything? No. It destroyed a lot of lives. There'd probably be a lot of doctors, a lot of good things that might have been invented. Probably 10,000 Chicanos who are dead, who might still be alive. They'd have kids and families. They're not here anymore. They're just not here.
Thank you, Lea. Graciela, I'm gonna ask you a question next, and it's almost a perfect turn-on, because the Vietnam War was late 60s officially, 75, April 75, the last Marines are in the helicopter on that hotel roof being pulled out. And then you served in the first Gulf War. The first President Bush was really excited in that war because he says we kicked the Vietnam War syndrome. So you kind of bracket along, you know, your military participation was affected by the Vietnam War and also was a whole new onda. So can you first tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to serve? Because I think that's an important part of your story, and then what you want to say. I know you brought some prepared comments.
So, who's doing the slides? I'd love to have the first slide up there, Latinas Serving Proudly. So I'm here really, I'll answer the question of how it happened, because I had no military history in my family whatsoever. I grew up in a small town in Colorado where largest employer was a meatpacking plant. So my papi was a sastre, and my mom stayed home with us and figured creative cottage ways to, to make money at home. So I was the oldest of 5 kids born to Argentina Tiscareno, Mexican immigrant. So I knew I wanted to go to college. I knew we had no money for college. And I knew that the recruiters who were in the cafeteria were there to pull us out of high school directly into the service, which meant no college. And so they were set up there, and I walked over here. I totally avoided the recruiters because I thought I knew what the military was. Of course I didn't, because I didn't have any experience whatsoever. But I had a college counselor, and I said, I want to go to college. How do I do this? And I was there all the time. I would like to go to Berkeley because they have a great architecture environmental design program. She said, come to my house for dinner. My husband is an Air Force officer, and he'll tell you how he went to college. He got an Air Force ROTC scholarship. And that's how I learned that there's a way to get the military to pay for you to go to college, and that there's a difference between that and going in out of high school, the enlisted ranks and the officer ranks. Again, my own personal education at the home of my counselor. So thank God for mentors, and I tell my story very frequently because our kids need to know there's this option. So that's how it happened. I wanted to go to school, and this was a way to have the Air Force pay. So I came from Colorado directly to Berkeley, sight unseen, scholarship cadet, majored in environmental design and architecture, majored also in marching band with my trombone, and then did aerospace studies. So when I finished, I got commissioned as a second lieutenant United States Air Force. And I recognize this is a very different story for a little Mexicana, daughter of immigrants. My story is very unusual. And so I have a great responsibility to tell that story to as many young kids as possible, which is why I write the books that I do. But I'm one of many Latinas, which is why these mujeres are behind me right now. Literally behind me, and I grabbed their photos and I called them and they told me their stories. But I want to address the question of why it's important. I'll give you 3 reasons why it's important that we are heard and that we have these moments where we're recognized. First, just like in the Latino community, there's a lot of negative media portrayals of military women. We're victims. Wow, like every news story you see, it's horrible. Why on earth would you let your daughter serve with that kind of news coverage, right? So we recognize that that's a very skewed view of our service. And so we want to be seen as the leaders that we are, with the responsibility that we've had very early in our lives. So behind me right here, I'll just, all the services are represented, but what I have behind me here, I have Stephanie Flores, machinist mate in the Navy, who is also a translator for humanitarian missions. She's the first one in the upper left. She says, it's my favorite picture because even though I was a machinist mate, as soon as they needed a volunteer to do humanitarian missions in Nicaragua, I was there. So we want to be there. We want to take the risks. We want to do the different thing. It's an extraordinary place for young Latinas to get incredible experiences. Okay? And so she's one. And then, we have Elizabeth Perez. Next to her, we have Elsa Perez, Army Privates, First Class, Xiomara Sosa. My picture's in the lower left with one of the all-women crews I flew with in England on the KC-135. Next to me is Captain Maria Carolina Gonzalez Prats with her squad in Afghanistan. Then we have Sergeant Campos, and then Captain Sandra Tibbs. So this is just 8 friends that I could get pictures of, today. So they represent so many more of us. But in this picture, we have leadership. We have 3 PhDs and 6 business owners. So yeah, the military is education, it's leadership, it's business creation, it's job creation for other Americans. It's all those things to us, and I don't know what my life would be if I hadn't done it. The second reason is I think we're culturally misunderstood. I don't think there's a huge acceptance of Latinas going into the service just yet. Some families, yes, with a history, some not so much. If you go first, it's kind of weird. A woman in Towson, a Latina in Towson, I was there doing a training with student vets. She cried her eyes out afterwards and came and gave me a hug. She says, do you know what my mom says to me when she calls me just about every day? What? Now that you're out of the Army, are you going to go ahead and get married and have kids now? So I was like, what am I going to do to get my mother to understand how important this is to me to serve and to get my education, use my GI Bill? So I think I want to just say, please accept your daughter if she makes that choice. A lot of women have worked really hard to open doors, as have men, to give her that option.